Good day, friends. Welcome to another Word of Gord. Today we're continuing on with our average folks in the afterlife and further reading and investigation from Jürgen Hughes' Vistas of Infinity, that remarkable series of out-of-body accounts and explorations. The leading book in its field as far as I'm concerned, and one for other out-of-body travelers to measure themselves against, I would say. Endlessly interesting encounters, some of which expand upon areas of interest that we already know about from earlier books, and others which explore entirely new territories. And for those of you who have been following along, I'm sure that today's episode will be of great interest to you. And so, let me plunge right in. I emerged into an open square. Judging by the surroundings, I was on a lower dimensional counterpart of our physical world, but I did not recognize the town, only that everything was exactly as one would expect in any city in England. There was a group of young men in their late 20s and early 30s who I decided to interview before moving on. I still had many questions regarding the level that was so close to our Earth and what made it different. I asked a young man with dark hair and everyday street clothing whether he knew he was dead, which he confirmed. What makes this world different from Earth? I wanted to know. Nothing really, came the answer, except all the usual benefits of not having to work or worry about your health, money, or career. He then showed me a medium-sized boat with a wooden hull he had just purchased, which was moored to a small landing bridge. I was surprised by the term he used, purchase. Do you have money here then? Kind of, he said. He told me there is some form of currency which he couldn't explain and sounded different from the kind of currency we are used to on our physical world. Things still have to be made here, and it requires effort, focus, and concentration, like my boat here. I didn't make it. I became aware that on this dimension, everything was still very much more physical than one would expect from a non-physical level. And instead of manifesting simply by thought, as on the higher dimensions, there still seemed to be an element of effort involved. As my interview continued, I saw a group of interested bystanders forming around us. They seemed to be aware that I was not from their reality system and still in possession of a physical body. I noticed very few people around here took advantage of the art of flying and gave a quick demonstration by taking to the air and circling over their heads before landing on the ground. Too much effort, one person said after I rejoined their group. Can't see any reason at all why we should suddenly behave like birds. He had a valid point, and I realized the very basic dimension I was in, one where physical laws, habits, and behaviors were still very much in evidence, and the people living here were quite content continuing to live the lives they had been used to. One man in a blazer asked me whether I would be interested in taking a ride on his boat. He promised that this place here was just as good as my Earth. He invited me on board his motorboat, which had 2 levels and plenty of seats to accommodate all his friends. We embarked on the short journey down a wide and open river until it branched off and we came to a halt underneath a large open bridge crossing the water. Everyone looked at a small group of people standing on the bridge. I became aware of a strange mixture of sadness and decorum. I asked a fellow passenger what this was all about. He told me that the people on the bridge were crossing over, going to another level, and some of them were friends of theirs. I was touched by the farewell and thought to myself that physical death is not the only time people depart from one another. But at least here they knew that that departure was only a temporary affair and that they could still contact each other if they wanted to. Seeing the people crossing the bridge in order to get to a higher level, I remembered my past experiences, that by employing the symbolic way of climbing, such as to the top level of a large building, one could find a way to the next level above. Rather than using meditation, I wanted to test this theory and climbed up the stairs to the upper deck of the boat, hoping that with the right attitude it would trigger in my mind the idea of rising. But obviously intent and hope are two different things, and my experiment had little effect. Instead, I thanked the captain for the invitation to travel with him and told him that my time was limited and I had to leave. I took to the air and returned to the square. In order to transcend this level, I decided to use the Om chant. The moment I uttered the word, the ground began to shake and the whole square was lit up. I was surprised by the powerful effect my chant had on the whole area, and I saw the astonished faces of the people gathered here, that they had probably never witnessed an effect like this before. Regardless, from deep within I conjured up the holy mantra again, and the air vibrated and the whole surrounding was cast into a brilliant light. Some people turned away or shielded their eyes. Then the scene faded, and instead I was surrounded by tapestries of millions of changing images and pattern, blazing with glorious lights in vivid colours. When, with the next chant, I willed my spiritual eyes to open to discern my new environment, I discovered, to my regret, that I'd opened my physical eyes. So, you can see, even with a vastly experienced projector like Jürgen is, he can still, sort of mistake one level for another and intend to go one place and wind up back in the physical. So if you find yourself doing this, do not despair. Just, try again and don't beat yourself up over it. There is, even in this world, plenty of time to practice. And the next projection, not having a date, I see. Before me was a square covered in grass in the middle of a strange town I did not recognize as a counterpart to any town I knew. What I was sure about was that this was not a very elevated place. This became clear when I looked at the people who looked ordinary, exactly as you would find people in any town on earth. Apart from the rather drab atmosphere, this is a giveaway, as on the higher dimension people generally look more attractive. Yes. I watched a group of men and women crowding around a man in a captain's uniform who was trying to capture their attention in order to entice them on a sightseeing tour on his 40-foot cruiser, which was moored to a jetty just behind him. I approached and mixed with the group. Trying clumsily to strike up a conversation with a couple next to me by asking them whether they knew whether they were dead. They looked at me as if I was some kind of simpleton, so I took that as a yes and moved on. The guy with the captain's hat was busy flaunting his boat trips, trying to persuade the crowd to join him for a pleasure trip. Most boarded his boat over a little landing bridge. The atmosphere was not very bright, but dusky, without any sunlight, and the water was quite dark, with the waves gently reflecting back the twilight. The river cruiser had an open deck on top of a closed one. The open one had filled up first. It was covered in a gaudy pattern, well finished, but a little bit twee for my taste. The bridge, too, was open. I guess the captain could talk to his passengers simply by turning around. After everybody had boarded, I addressed the captain and asked him why he was doing this, and he told me that most of the people taking the trip were new arrivals in the land of the dead. He said, with a slightly sarcastic grin. He told me he'd made it his job to welcome people. Most don't have a clue what is going on, and some may even think they are dreaming. This gives them some time to relax, and of course there is music. It was only now that I heard a tune which seemed to be coming from a radio. It gives me an opportunity to talk to them and let them know what is happening here, like an introduction tour. He grinned, and for a moment I considered him to be like a modern version of the ferryman of death, taking the passengers across the River Styx. But for that he just looked too casual and jovial. He also told me that sometimes he has musicians on board and catering, and there was a real party atmosphere, but it very much depended on his passengers. In any case, he was determined to show people a good time and lift their spirits. Looking at his boat, I noticed there was another man talking to the new arrivals and shaking hands. He wore a white skipper's hat and smiled a lot. The captain explained he had staff to answer questions and help with the drinks. There is, of course, a payoff for me and my crew for providing this service, he said. After every trip, the cruiser gets bigger and better. When I started, I had little more than a rowing boat, carrying 4 people maximum. I get a lot of pleasure out of this. I wished the captain all my best, left the boat and wandered over to another group of people. I was keen to interview someone who had been resident here for some time. A man in his 30s with a blue shirt and a white tie was an obvious target. "Have you been here long?" I asked him. "Long enough," he replied. I inquired whether he would agree to me asking a few questions, which he did. I was curious about whether there was some kind of equivalent to Earth's economy here, a question which keeps popping up whenever I see signs of commercial activity. "Do you use money?" "I have never come across this," he laughed. "This is a place where you can happily live and survive without any money, I am glad to say." I clearly remembered when in a bar on a previous OBE occasion, when trying to find people to interview, I had ordered a drink, and as if by magic pulled some strange coins out of my pocket and handed these to the bartender, who took it without questioning. I now wondered whether he did that so as not to embarrass me. I walked down the road with a road with 2-story buildings and shops on either side. Then I entered one with the door open, the inside completely open plan, with furniture on display but not very densely packed. On one side, partitioned off from the rest of the showroom, I spotted a large bed covered with blue sheets and a young woman sitting on it looking slightly lost. "How long have you been here?" I wanted to know. "Not very long," she answered. "I made a friend and we made this bed our kind of refuge where we sat and talked, but she has left and I don't know where she went." She looked a bit sad. I felt like comforting her and started by saying that, like everything I guess, it will take a bit of time to get used to things, and that her friend was probably just finding things out for herself. We then chatted a bit more, but I suddenly felt aware that I was idling away time and that I could make better use of my out-of-body experience. Remembering that I was actually meant to be sitting in my chair meditating, I was not doing anything like meditation, but was wasting time wandering around rather aimlessly in a fairly low-level environment. With that, I left the shop, and soon I was out in the open, and by myself I chanted the Om mantra. Instantly I was airborne, and the environment around me began to fade. The pleasure of being pulled skywards and drifting through bands of beautiful colours is difficult to describe. Nevertheless, I was aware that this was not a spiritual state as such, more like a soft wave of joyful emotion. This made me clearly aware that I was still on an astral level. As I focused on my surroundings, I realized I hadn't transcended very far at all, perhaps just above the state I had come from. The environment was much brighter, though. I was suspended in mid-air as I drifted over houses and rooftops. Here, at last, there was sunlight, the colours more vibrant and the season more summery than before. But as soon as I began acclimatizing, I was pulled down to earth as if by a magnet. After a gentle landing, I noticed just how earthly this level of reality was. I could have easily been in any normal waking world, and if somebody had said so, I wouldn't have found it hard to believe. Instead, I refocused my attention on the mantra again. This time, a large wave of energy grabbed me and flung me over a massive abyss, filled as far as my eyes could see with geometric pattern and structures. I paused in the air to take the sight. This was truly breathtaking, and instead of continuing with my meditation, I stopped and drank in the sight. As an artist, this was impossible to ignore. Now I knew for sure that I had cleared the great divide of the astral level and was in a world of thoughts and form. I cleared a massive structure of intense purple colour in multiple nuances, like an enormous Gothic arch that dwarfed everything around it. I found a familiar landscape which I recognized only as familiar because it gave me a feeling of being at home. My surroundings, however, were like nothing I had ever seen before. The intricacies of the textures, the evolving shapes around me, which painted and sculpted the scenery as I went along, were of such incredible richness and complexity that it would be impossible to reproduce it in any form, in any media known to man. This was simply too overwhelmingly rich and too rapidly changing for any artist to be able to capture. I drifted through incredible thoroughfares of shapes with multi-layered iridescent patterns, perfectly designed, often too awesome to study and comprehend their origin or nature of their existence, because the moment I tried, the shapes started to shift, change and permeate into new patterns. Everything at its root level was made of light. The most astonishing thing of all was that this world interacted with me. With every breath I took and every thought or feeling I released, it released and responded by adjusting the subtle curves and colours, and moved obediently into new configurations. I recall that experiencers of LSD and DMT will make similar observations about some of the otherworldly environments they find themselves in. This all had a joyful effect, but I cannot call it joy in a known or traditional sense, because joys known previously had limits, were exhaustible. Here they were not, because they fanned out into new refinements of joys, just like the landscape evolved in front of my eyes. This ecstasy filled me with light and being as I realized that I had become one with joy, and I lit up, nurtured by what my spiritual eyes were drinking in. It became dark, but only relatively so, because I was drifting like a giant eagle over an earthly landscape with great mountains in the distance and city lights. I was aware that this was not an earthly country, but another great non-physical reality created by disembodied men and women. Gently I descended to the ground, onto a vast mushroom-shaped hill with a gentle dome and overhanging sides, covered in velvety soft green grass, untouched, swaying gently in some heavenly breath. Dotted all over this were clusters of trees and lights. I landed next to a great ancient oak of indefinable age, but its mighty branches bent skillfully and artistically into various directions and shapes, as if following the forces of a different kind to those of our earthly nature that could in any way muster. Judging by the light, it felt like a beautiful summer evening, catching the golden rays of a setting sun and painting the world in a soft colour, with ambient shadows, again in purple hues, so subtle they were barely discernible. As I rose again, I began to notice how huge this earthly mushroom island actually was, and that I was not the only occupier. Among the many trees were benches and people wandering around, leisurely sitting down and enjoying their summer's wealth. Some were playing instruments and some were dancing. As I ascended further into the air, so I could appreciate the scenery better, I saw a restaurant emerge farther away, surrounded by tables and benches, people having their meals and were drinking and chatting cheerfully and laughing. I began to notice that the trees I had passed were caught in the light of an invisible torch I seemed to be carrying, and everywhere I went the surroundings seemed to be lit up. The self-lighted world again. Soon I caught the attention of a few passers-by who looked at me with amazement, pointing at me, their faces lighting up. I tried to encourage them to follow my lead and rise into the air to enjoy the weightlessness, but instead they were running along beside me, cheering and skipping like little children chasing a balloon. All this attention seemed to have an invigorating effect, and I felt a strong burst of energy which I released back on the spectators. As I drifted farther, people got up from their benches and one by one they followed my lead, rising into the air wherever I passed, shouting and laughing as if I was some kind of fairground attraction that needed to be tested. As I drifted past the restaurant, nearly everyone was airborne. People were holding hands and forming squadrons, singing as they did so. Their combined joy had a powerful illuminating effect, lighting up the whole land and its atmosphere for miles around. I took leave when I became aware of my physical body. My chin was resting on my chest and I'd slumped forward from an upright meditating position. For a few moments I remained in this position, frozen and still, knowing that if I moved, even breathed, I would lose the link to my journey. So I remained and revisited the whole event twice over. Then I got up and entered it in my diary. An inspiring trip that one was. Getting people up to fly finally. I might add that I've had over the years several experiences of being a passenger on one of those river cruise boats for the newly arrived and those asleep. And on one of those, I had the funniest experience once years ago of I thought I'd freak out the people on the boat as they were, a lot of them were asleep that night and just, going for a little trip that they might or might not remember in the morning. And so I jumped off the boat, landed on the water and ran across the water, walking on water to the shore. And then ran back again and jumped on the boat, much to folks' amusement. I was certainly not the captain of that ship or that boat. I was just a passenger, but I was, something of a guide for those who either didn't quite realize they were sleeping or did but would forget in the morning. Anyway, the next section is even more interesting than the one we just experienced. And we will get to that very soon. And until then, friends, I wish you a fond farewell and much fun in your own travels.